Tonight, as we continue our study in the book of Esther, we're going to focus on chapter 3, verses 3 through 11. The book of Esther is a fascinating book. It's probably most fascinating since God's name is never mentioned in the book, but yet as we read the story, we can see God working behind the scenes. We can see God working in circumstances, and we can see God working in the lives of people. So even though God's not mentioned, He's the unseen God who's controlling the story. His hand is all over this story. And I think that's the greatest application, that many times in our own lives we can't necessarily see what God is doing, but He is up to something. And often it's after the story's over, we have to look back and we go, oh, that's what God was doing. And that's often true in this story about Esther. Well, the whole book begins with King Xerxes. He's the king of the Persian Empire, and he holds this elaborate banquet basically to show off and to gain support for his military campaign against the Greeks. His father lost against the Greeks, and he wants to avenge that loss. And so he throws the elaborate banquet, he gains all kinds of support, and things are going perfectly until he invites the queen, Vashti, into the banquet. And she doesn't want to come, and she doesn't come. And because of that, King Xerxes decides, I got to get rid of the queen. So he dethrones the queen, which opens the door for a new queen. So that story is very important at the beginning because it opens the door, of course, for Esther. The second section of the book, the one we're in right now, involves Esther, Mordecai, and Haman. They are the three main characters in the book, and in this section, they all have their individual story. And it begins with Esther, and she becomes the new queen. So here's this Jewish girl living in the capital city, one of the capital cities of the Persian Empire, and she becomes the queen of Persia. However, she doesn't let anybody know that she's Jewish. King Xerxes has no clue that Esther is a Jewish girl. Mordecai, who's her cousin, who also adopted her, in many ways was her father, raised her that way, told her not to tell anybody that you're Jewish, and so far she has kept it a complete secret. So Esther's story is she's the queen. Then Mordecai has a story. Mordecai is a Jewish man who works for King Xerxes. He's one of the officials. He's got a pretty decent job working for the king, and he uncovers a plot by a couple of individuals who want to assassinate the king. So Mordecai finds out about it. Mordecai tells Queen Esther, and Queen Esther tells the king, and the plot is uncovered, and the plot is foiled, and the two individuals who tried to assassinate the king were executed. And we would expect at the end of that story for Mordecai to be honored, for the king to come along and give Mordecai this incredible promotion for saving his life. I mean, after all, what is more important than saving the king's life? However, the king seems to have forgotten the story. Mordecai is not honored at all. And as a reader of this book, we're going, what's going on? I mean, why isn't Mordecai given honor and respect for what he did? He showed great loyalty to the king. But instead of Mordecai being promoted, that brings us to the third individual, and that is Haman. And at the beginning of chapter 3, it's Haman who gets a promotion. And if you're a Jewish reader of this book, you are throwing a fit. I mean, why should Haman get promoted? In fact, the author doesn't even tell us what he did. But whatever Haman did, it could not be more important than saving the king's life, which is what Mordecai did. Mordecai should be promoted. But instead, Haman gets promoted. So he gets this high-ranking position. In fact, it's the top official. He's like the number 2 man in charge of the Persian Empire. He's right under the king. And Mordecai is going, what about me? Nothing. And then the king decides that everyone should bow down and show great honor and respect to Haman. And so everybody does, except Mordecai. Mordecai refuses to bow down before Haman or to show him honor and respect. And we talked a little bit last week about why that's true. We find out that Haman is an Agagite. He's an Amalekite. The Israelites and the Amalekites have been at each other's throat for over 1,000 years. And in just about every story in the Old Testament, the Israelites win. But yet that tension, that animosity continues. And Mordecai, growing up, would hear all of these stories about the Amalekites and how the Israelites always won. And so Mordecai's thinking, I'm a Jewish man. I'm not bowing down before an Amalekite. I mean, we defeated them every time in the Old Testament in those stories. So I'm not bowing down before an enemy of God's people. And so he doesn't. The king commands that everybody bow before Haman, and everybody does except Mordecai. And that's where we left off last week. So let me read Esther chapter 3, verses 3 through 11. That's as far as we're going to get tonight. So Esther chapter 3, beginning with verse 3. Then the royal officials at the king's gate asked Mordecai, "Why do you disobey the king's command?" Day after day they spoke to him, but he refused to comply. Therefore they told Haman about it to see whether Mordecai's behavior would be tolerated, for he had told them he was a Jew. When Haman saw that Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor, he was enraged. Yet having learned who Mordecai's people were, he scorned the idea of killing only Mordecai. Instead, Haman looked for a way to destroy all Mordecai's people, the Jews, throughout the whole kingdom of Xerxes. In the 12th year of King Xerxes, in the first month, the month of Nisan, the poor, that is the lot, was cast in the presence of Haman to select a day and month. And the lot fell on the 12th month, the month of Adar. Then Haman said to King Xerxes, "There is a certain people dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom who keep themselves separate. Their customs are different from those of all other people, and they do not obey the king's laws. It is not in the king's best interest to tolerate them. If it pleases the king, let a decree be issued to destroy them, and I will give 10,000 talents of silver to the king's administrators for the royal treasury." So the king took his signet ring from his finger and gave it to Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews. "Keep the money," the king said to Haman, "and do with the people as you please." So a fascinating story involving Haman and Mordecai. So Haman gets promoted. Everyone's supposed to bow. And now we're going to look at Haman's anger in verses 3 through 6. And it begins with the fact that everybody notices that Mordecai has an issue with Haman. I mean, everybody else is bowing down. Everybody else is talking about how great Haman is, except Mordecai. Now, what's so fascinating is that Haman doesn't seem to be paying any attention. He hasn't yet noticed that Mordecai's not bowing before him or showing him honor or respect. So some of the officials, and Mordecai's one of them, ask him a question. Why do you disobey the king's command? And it's interesting how they ask the question. They don't ask, "Hey, Mordecai, why don't you kneel before Haman like the rest of us? You know, what is it, Mordecai? You don't like the guy? You know, why don't you show him honor and respect? I mean, the king has promoted him. You should be doing that." But instead, the question's a little more serious. Why do you disobey the king's command? Because the king commanded everybody to bow before Haman. So this is a request to know, and also some of these people are probably Mordecai's friends. It's like, Mordecai, what are you doing? You're disobeying the king's command. You're going to get yourself in trouble. You need to just, follow along with the rest of us and bow before Haman. Well, verse 4 says, day after day, they spoke to him, but he refused to comply. So they're asking him every day. And every day Mordecai says, no way. I'm not bowing before Haman. No way that I'm doing this. Therefore, they told Haman about it to see whether Mordecai's behavior would be tolerated. Now, the Persians were somewhat known for tolerance. The Persian official policy was that if you're part of the Persian Empire, then you can practice the individual customs and religion of your people. So you don't have to all follow and worship the gods of the Persians. You can continue to follow your customs and worship whatever you want to worship. So the Persians, for the most part, had an open policy with people. In fact, it was Cyrus the Persian who allowed the Jewish people to go back to the land of Israel, back to their homeland, to reestablish their country. Nebuchadnezzar drugged them out of their country because he wanted everybody to believe and act like a Babylonian, but the Persians were a little bit different. They let the people follow their own customs. But the question becomes, to what extent are they going to be tolerant? Especially now that we have an individual who won't follow the king's command by bowing before the king's top official. Is that going to be tolerated, or will it not be tolerated? Then it says, for he had told them that he was a Jew. And that was the issue. You see, Mordecai grew up hearing stories about the Jewish people and the Amalekites. And there are at least two key stories in the Old Testament about those groups. And the first one goes all the way back to the time of Moses. Moses gets the people out of Egypt. They're in the wilderness. They're going to be there for 40 years. But at one point, they are attacked by the Amalekites. And Joshua is the one who leads the Israelites into battle. Moses is up on the hill praying with his hands raised in the air. Aaron and Hur are holding up Moses' hands, because as long as his hands are raised, Israel wins the war. And at the end of the day, Israel wins. The Amalekites are defeated. Then there's the time of King Saul. Saul is the first king of Israel. One of his first battles is against the Amalekites. And God basically says, wipe them out. And Saul wins the battle. However, he keeps some sheep alive. He also keeps King Agag alive, at least for a while. And he wins, but he doesn't follow God's complete instructions. And it was because of that God said, Saul, you can't be king anymore. I've got to find somebody else. And eventually he finds David. Well, King Agag is related to Haman. Haman is one of the descendants. He's an Agagite. So that's the connection. So here's Mordecai growing up hearing all of these stories. And David, when David became king, he basically demolished the Amalekites. And Mordecai is saying, we win all the time. There is no way I'm bowing down before an Amalekite. I mean, they ought to bow down before me because we win every war against them. So Mordecai is pretty stubborn at this point, and he won't bow before Haman, who's one of his ancient enemies. Haman finds out. Somebody tells him. Apparently somebody more, they like Haman more than they like Mordecai. So they tell Haman, hey, there's this guy named Mordecai, and he won't bow before you. He won't pay you any honor or respect. Haman finds out about it, and he is enraged. He's absolutely angry. In fact, Haman's name is similar to the Hebrew word for wrath or anger, which is the name Hamah. So Hamah and Haman sound a little bit alike. And so in this story, Haman is Mr. Anger. That's his role. That's his personality. That's his temperament. And it's interesting that in the book so far, the word anger or wrath has been used 2 times. Both times it's used in reference to King Xerxes. And who is King Xerxes angry at? Vashti, the queen. Why is he angry with her? Because she stands him up. She won't do what he wants to do. She won't show him the proper respect by entering the banquet. And then his response to all of that is to go overboard. Instead of trying to work it out one-on-one, he gets his officials involved. He ends up issuing a decree. Vashti is no longer the queen, and a letter goes out to everybody in the Persian Empire that all women are to show honor and respect to their husbands. It was a complete overreaction to what was really a little issue between a husband and a wife, an issue between a king and a queen, and they should have simply resolved it, but instead it becomes this big issue. And we're going to see the same thing again. Haman is angry because Mordecai won't show him honor and respect. And in the ancient world, honor and respect were big issues. In fact, in the modern world, honor and respect continue to be big issues. So Haman is upset, and Haman is going to overreact. I mean, Haman could have tried to get Mordecai fired. He could have tried to get Mordecai executed. But Haman's going to have a much bigger response to all of this. And it's all because of his anger. Now, I wonder what stories Haman heard growing up about the Jewish people. Every time we fight them, we lose. I mean, it looks like we're going to win, but we just can't beat those guys. It looks like we have an advantage, but every time we go to war with the Jewish people, they defeat us. And perhaps they were just longing for a moment that one day in the future, we're going to win. We've lost all of those other times, but maybe the next time, we're going to win. And Haman finds out that Mordecai is Jewish, and this is an opportunity on behalf of his people to finally win one against the Jewish people. That's what Haman is thinking. So this rivalry, this conflict that's been going on for 1,000 years is about to have a new chapter. One more chapter will be written in the story between the Israelites and the Amalekites. Verse 6, having learned that who Mordecai's people were, he scorned the idea of killing only Mordecai. I mean, this could have just been a personal vendetta. You won't bow before me? Well, we'll just have your head cut off. No problem. We'll get rid of you. But it's bigger than that for Haman. This isn't about Haman versus Mordecai. This is about the Amalekites versus the Israelites. And this is an opportunity for Haman to make history among his own people. Oh yes, Agag lost. All those other people, they lost. But Haman is thinking, I can win this one. I can win this one for my own people. So he decides to look for a way to destroy all of Mordecai's people, the Jewish people. And if he can get rid of the Jewish people, he can go down in history of the Amalekites as a great hero. Everybody else lost, but he won. So he's looking for this great opportunity. Now, if Haman pulls off what he wants to do, that means every Jewish person in the Persian Empire would be annihilated, including those in the land of Israel, the promised land, the Jewish homeland. There are many Jewish people who have gone back to their homeland. They've restarted their country. They rebuilt the temple. They're trying to live by the law of Moses again. They are recognizing their covenant with God, and they're trying their best to get back on right terms with God. All of those people would be wiped out. I mean, God told them to go back to their homeland and restart their country. That was God's plan. But if they get wiped out, what's going to happen? This is 474 BC. The Messiah shows up in another 470 years. The Messiah must be born to a Jewish family. He's the Jewish Messiah. But if there are no Jewish families, the Messiah would have nobody to be born to. So this is a big issue. This is an issue that's much bigger than just Haman versus Mordecai. In fact, it's even bigger than just the Israelites versus the Amalekites. This is God versus Satan. God has a plan to send the Messiah, and it has to be through a Jewish family. But if Haman kills all the Jewish people, the Messiah can't be born. So that's Haman's plan, his anger that's fueled. We now come to his plan. How's he going to pull this off? You know, it's one thing to say you're going to kill all the Jewish people in the Persian Empire. How are you ever going to make that happen? How will you ever pull that one off? Well, it begins in verse 7 by telling us that it happens in the 12th year of King Xerxes. And that is the year 474 BC. Esther has now been queen somewhere between 4 and 5 years. So apparently for her first 4 to 5 years, things are really nice and things are going well. But now this is about to take place. So Esther's still the queen. She's been queen for a while. And it's going to take place in the first month, the month of Nisan. So that's kind of the background. And Nisan, by the way, in our calendar would be somewhere around March. So that would be the time frame. Something interesting is mentioned. It's called the poor. That is the lot. Now, in the ancient Near East, in countries like Persia, the Persian Empire, pagan peoples, to make a big decision, you had to have the will of the gods. And to have the will of the gods, you had to go to the astrologers, the magicians, in order to determine the will of the gods. And one of the ways in which people determined that was by the casting of lots. So by casting the lots, you would determine what the gods wanted to happen. They also was looking for the most favorable time for something to take place. And by casting the lots and by the gods controlling the lots, that's what you would end up with. So what the Persians did at the beginning of the year in the first month is they would set the calendar for the year by casting lots. And they would determine the most favorable days to do certain things, and the astrologers and the magicians would make all of this happen. So that's what Haman's going to do. He wants to get rid of the Jews, but when will it happen? Well, it's going to be determined by the casting of lots, which they call the poor. That's the Persian word for the casting of lots. And it's interesting that archaeologists have uncovered a quadrilangular prism-type dice from Susa. And this dice was either something they would roll on the ground and it would reveal something, or something they would kind of grab out of a bag without looking and it would reveal something. So it was all by chance that this would take place. Now, the Israelites did have something similar. The high priest carried 2 dice with him. One was black, one was white. And you could inquire of the high priest, who would inquire of God and ask a yes-no question. He would reach into his pocket and pull one of them out, and that would be your answer. So the Jewish people did something similar. Well, they cast the lots, and the lot falls on the 12th month, the month of Adar, which is February on our calendar. This is not going to happen for 11 months. So Haman is going to try to get the king to issue an edict that all the Jewish people would be killed on a certain day, but the day that's going to be chosen is going to be 11 months from the time the edict goes out. That's a long time. Now, you could think today, if you had 11 months to prepare for something, you could do a lot. And even in the ancient world, when communication was much slower, 11 months is a long time to prepare. If the lot had come up with 2 months, 3 months, 4 months, the Jewish people could have been in a lot of trouble. But in 11 months, that's a long time to make preparation. So it's interesting that Haman, in having the magicians throw the lot, he wanted the will of the gods. But I'm thinking he got an answer from the God of the people he's trying to annihilate. This could be one more example of God working behind the scenes. One more example of God controlling the circumstances, even though his name is never mentioned in the book. Because 11 months is time. 3 months, not so much. And there's this great verse in Proverbs. The lot is cast into the lap, but its every decision is from the Lord. God must have intervened in the casting of lots among the Persians, who were praying to gods and goddesses. But God intervenes on behalf of his people and gives them 11 months to respond to what's going to happen. Now, it's interesting that Haman does all of this, and he still hasn't got permission from the king. That comes next in verse 8. Haman and Xerxes are going to have a conversation. And this conversation reveals a lot about both men. Xerxes is a weak-willed leader who's not very good at making decisions, who's easily manipulated. Xerxes is a king who really doesn't understand what's going on in his own kingdom. Think about the decisions that Xerxes has made so far. He asked Vashti to come into his banquet without thinking that maybe that would dishonor her. Bad choice. Then he decides to get rid of the queen. Bad choice. He comes back from battle looking to go home to his wife and realizing, oh yeah, I got rid of her. And then there's Mordecai, who saves his life, reveals the assassination plot. And what does Xerxes do? He forgets about it. And then he promotes this guy named Haman. Xerxes is not a good king, and he makes horrible decisions, and he can be manipulated. Haman, on the other hand, is rather shrewd. He knows how to put together an argument and get what he wants. Haman is someone who's very power hungry, and he understands that he can manipulate the king and get anything he wants from the king. So, in these verses, actually verse 8, Haman presents an argument as to why the Jewish people should be annihilated. His argument includes an element of truth, a half-truth, and an outright lie. Haman may have made a good politician. Just throw a little truth, a half-truth, and an outright lie out there, and you've got an argument. Well, let's start with truth. Well, before we start with the truth, it's interesting what Haman doesn't say. He refers to a certain people in the Persian Empire. He never comes out and says the Jewish people. He refers to them as a certain people. And from a literary standpoint, Haman never identifies the group in question as being the Jewish people. He never tells Xerxes who the people are. He simply describes them as a certain people. Now, maybe historically he does, but as you read this book, Haman never reveals who he's talking about. It's just a certain people. Maybe he doesn't mention the Jewish people because Xerxes' predecessors, Cyrus and Darius, had both made proclamations that favored the Jewish people. So maybe he leaves that part of the story out. Okay, here's the truth. The Jewish people are dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of the kingdom. That's true. Many of the Jewish people are back in the Promised Land, their own homeland, and they're trying to restart their nation. But when Cyrus the Persian said to the Jewish people, "You can go back home and restart your nation," some of them did. Many of them said, "We kind of like it here. I mean, why should I leave my well-paying job? I have a nice place to live. I have plenty of food to go back to a deserted country where there's nothing and start over." I mean, you can imagine a group of people, maybe they're at the height of their career. I mean, they're making good money. They're happy. They enjoy their job. They have a nice place to live. They've mingled with the Gentiles, and the Gentiles are friendly to them. They're going, why should I leave all of that to go back and start from scratch again? So many of the Jewish people did not go back to their homeland. They lived among the Gentiles, and they were happy doing that. So Haman's right about that. They are scattered throughout the Persian Empire. Now there's a half-truth. These people are separate, and their customs are different from all the other people. Well, yes, the Jewish people do have customs that make them separate from other people. If they're following the law of Moses, they are circumcising their male babies. The Gentiles didn't do that. If they're following the food laws, they're only eating certain food. It has to be kosher food. The Gentiles would eat anything that didn't eat them. And then there's the Sabbath day. And only the Jewish people would observe the Sabbath. The Gentiles, no. So, yes, it's true that the Jewish people have their own customs. And they do tend to be separate. However, the Jewish people have found a way to intermingle among the Gentiles and not cause a problem. So it's a half-truth. Yes, they're different, but people are getting along with them and they're getting along with people. Now here's the outright lie. They do not obey the king's laws. There's only one Jewish person in the story who doesn't obey the king's law. That's Mordecai. And he only disobeys one law of the king. Not all the king's laws, just one. And the one law that he disobeys is he's not about to bow down before Haman and show him honor and respect. So one Jewish man breaks one law, and all of a sudden all the Jewish people are breaking all the king's laws. Total exaggeration. Now, it's interesting about this king. Most kings would say, what certain people are you talking about? That would be an obvious question. Okay, so they're scattered throughout the kingdom. So which customs do you have a problem with? He never asks. And what laws are they breaking? What exactly are they doing that has you so upset? doesn't ask any of those questions. So Haman has this very vague, generalized statement that there's a people group who are dispersed and influential, they're not following the king's laws, and they deserve to be punished. That's all he says. He gives no details. In fact, he really doesn't say much at all. But apparently it becomes rather persuasive. And then he says, it's not in the king's best interest to tolerate them. The last conspiracy was the assassination plot. And who uncovered it and kept it from happening? 2 Jewish people, Mordecai and Esther. No, you can't tolerate those people. They saved your life, but you can't tolerate them. So his argument is totally bogus. There's nothing to it. So how does the king respond? Well, Haman's not quite done yet. If it pleases the king, and that's what he wants to please the king, make the king happy, let a decree be issued to destroy them. I mean, that's extreme. To destroy all of these people. And I will give 10,000 talents of silver to the king's administrators for the royal treasury. So, king, let's make a deal. You destroy these people, and I can bring home 10,000 talents of silver, which silver was the currency of the Persian Empire. And 10,000 talents is a whole lot of money. It was pretty much half of what would come into the entire Persian Empire for an entire year. This is a huge sum of money. Why would the king be interested in money? The king had just spent a lot of money going to war against the Greeks. And the king came home a loser. He lost the war. And so the royal treasury is a little bit depleted. And king, I've got an idea, and if you go along with this, you're going to make a lot of money on the deal. This deal's not going to cost you money. This deal's going to make you money. Yeah, that's quite persuasive. And yes, Haman is very shrewd in what he wants to say to the king. So the king takes off his signet ring from his finger and gives it to Haman. The signet ring was used to sign official documents throughout the empire. And by putting that signet ring, that seal on the document, it would give it all the authority of the throne. So Haman now has the ring. Okay, it's like giving somebody your credit card and saying, go spend whatever you want. It's that extreme. Haman's got the ring. The king's willing to give it up. It's like having the king's signature in advance and you fill in the details. Whatever you want him to sign, he's not going to even look at it. He'll just sign it. So the ring is given to Haman. And notice how he's described. The Agagite. Oh yes. All the way back to the days of King Saul and King Agag. This ancient rivalry between the Amalekites and the Israelites. And Haman's got the signet ring. And he's the enemy of the Jews. In fact, that's the first of 5 times in this book that Haman is called the enemy of the Jews. He's also called their enemy in chapter 7, chapter 8, and twice in chapter 9. The Jewish people now have a problem. Their enemy, their ancient enemy, an Amalekite, holds the number 2 position in the Persian Empire, and he wants all the Jewish people destroyed. And now he has the king's signet ring and the authority to make it happen. Verse 11, the king says to Haman, in fact, he says 2 things to Haman. The first is, keep the money. And that may not be a good translation. Literally it says, the silver is given to you. And chances are this is a figure of speech, an idiom, a metaphor, where basically Haman is being told, yes, I agree with you. I'm going to go along with your plan. Just bring home the silver. So I think bring home the silver would be better than keep the money. So yes, he wants him to bring the money. He's not telling Haman to keep the money because Haman doesn't have the money. Haman doesn't personally have 10,000 talents of silver, lying in his tent somewhere. How is Haman going to get the money? Well, when they kill the Jewish people, they're going to plunder their stuff. In fact, verse 13 says that. We'll look at that in a couple of weeks. So, the Jewish people will be killed, annihilated. All their stuff will be taken and accumulated, and it will be worth at least 10,000 talents of silver. That's the plan. So Xerxes says, bring back the money, and then do with the people as you please. The king just hands it all over to Haman. He's in charge. And it's interesting what it really says in the Hebrew. Deal with the people as it seems good to you. And what seems good to Haman? To kill them all, which is not good, but evil. So, at this point, the Jewish people have a huge problem on their hand. Haman has the king's authority to annihilate them and to take all their stuff. The only thing going for the Jewish people at this point is, it's not going to happen for 11 months. So there's some time involved. Well, let me wrap this up with a couple of applications. And one of the applications is that we live our lives trying to plan them out and make good decisions. And for the most part, that works. But every once in a while, we run into some unexpected circumstances. Some circumstances where we say, I didn't see that one coming. I had no idea that would take place. Well, that's the issue that Mordecai is now dealing with. And as you look at the story of Mordecai, Esther becomes the queen. Oh, that's great. So his daughter, actually cousin, but he raised her as a daughter, she's the queen. That means Mordecai's got some influence over the Persian Empire. He's got influence with the king. That's good. Then Mordecai saves the king's life from an assassination plot. And that's good. And Mordecai's living on top of the world. But then the king forgets about him. And then instead of him getting promoted, Haman gets promoted. His rival gets promoted. Ever happened to you? In your work, maybe you thought, you deserved the promotion and the person that doesn't like you got it. That's what happened to Mordecai. And now, Mordecai's got 11 months to live. And he and all the Jewish people will die. He went from being on top of the world to having the world on top of him. Unexpected circumstances. How do you handle those? We're going to find out in chapter 4 how Mordecai is going to handle those circumstances. Well, there's another issue. That one was personal. This one's more historical. This is an attempt by the Amalekites to destroy and get rid of the Israelites. It's amazing that ever since God chose Abraham as the father of the Jewish people, that Satan has wanted to get rid of the Jewish people. Because Satan knows that all of God's plans center around the Jewish people and all the promises that God made to the Jewish people. And as you look at the Old Testament and read the Old Testament, God made some promises to the Jewish people that are not yet fulfilled. I mean, there's some stuff out there that hasn't happened yet, but it will. But Satan's philosophy has been to get rid of God's people. And here's an example of it. And if Haman succeeds, God's people will be destroyed, and God's plans will be destroyed. World War II, Adolf Hitler, 6 million Jewish people die. Get rid of the Jewish people. But it was amazing that shortly after World War II, in 1948, May the 14th, the nation of Israel was reborn. As basically Great Britain decided if the people just had a country, this would have never happened. And so Great Britain and others encouraged the Jewish people, go back to your homeland, restart your country. And they did. Then there was the Six-Day War in 1967. And on paper, the Jewish people didn't stand a chance. But the Jewish people won overwhelmingly and recaptured Jerusalem. And then there was last year, October the 7th, 2023, Hamas, Gaza, the issue that's still ongoing today, and the terrorists that want to get rid of the Israelites. And Israel is surrounded by enemies, and Israel is about the size of New Jersey. And there's all these enemies that want to get rid of them. And one of Satan's philosophies that continues today is get rid of the Jewish people, get rid of God's plan. In fact, we read in the book of Revelation, Satan's philosophy is very simple. Get rid of all the Christians and the Jews, and Jesus has nobody to come back to. And that will be his plan. But yet we see God intervening time and time again. God protecting, preserving his people so that his plans can be accomplished. And here we are in 2024, and we see this conflict. I mean, in our own country, there were anti-Semitic displays and demonstrations. That there were people in our own country supporting the terrorists who wanted to get rid of Israel. Which, by the way, those same terrorists want to get rid of us. But yet we've got people in our country supporting them. And you go, who's thinking out there? Haman was shrewd. Why was he so shrewd? Satan is incredibly shrewd. But Jesus warned that the enemy comes to steal, to kill, and to destroy. And he does, every single time. So this conflict that we read about in the book of Esther, in many ways is still going on. And the war is still being fought. And will not be complete until Jesus returns. And when he returns as the King of the Jews. So there has to be an Israel for him to return to. There has to be Jewish people for him to return to. And he will. And he returns as our Savior, the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. So there has to be Christians as well. But Satan's fighting hard to destroy God's plan. And those of us who know God's plan and following God, we look at what's going on and go, what are those other people thinking? Well, maybe they're not. Maybe Satan's got them so confused they don't know what to believe. But God has a plan, and God will prevail, although Satan will fight to the very end. So we need to keep that in mind, that Satan will continue to fight until Jesus returns and he's captured and thrown into a pit for 1,000 years. Well, an incredible story. What's Mordecai going to do now? We'll pick up the story. Next week's the business meeting. Then in 2 weeks, we'll pick up the story, looking at the end of chapter 3 and then into chapter 4 as Mordecai has to respond to this, knowing this is all my fault. I brought this on my people. Now, what do I do? Well, let's pray. Heavenly Father, thank you for what an incredible story. But yet, Father, it's a story that gets retold It gets retold in our lives when we face circumstances that are against us. And we are just flabbergasted that they came out of nowhere, and now what do we do? And it's also historical as we continue to see the battle for planet Earth. We continue to see the battle over Israel. But yet, Father, we know you are going to prevail. And we must have faith that you will prevail. So, Father, I pray that you'll strengthen our faith, and may our faith in you grow deeper and stronger every day. I pray in Jesus' name. Amen.